Yeah, the time now is 14 minutes past 7 now to the Gazan border, where tens of thousands of Israeli troops are amassing. We know 300,000 people there amassing on the border. The question is what happens in terms of the incursion. We widely expect this incursion to happen. But, of course, it is anyone's guess. Of course, it's absolutely worth remembering there are civilians caught here on both sides. Now, Israel's Defense Secretary says that they will soon see Gaza from their inside, but their strategy remains unclear. Well, we're now joined by former military intelligence officer Frank Ledwidge. Frank, just in terms of strategy here for Israel, they've been warned to show restraint, not to repeat the mistakes that the US made after 9/11. This ground incursion widely expected to happen. Does Israel actually know what the end game looks like? Do they have a concerted strategy here?
Well, good morning, David. Yeah, that's the question that the soldiers on the border are going to want answered. And that'll feed through the generals. The chief of the Israeli General Staff, or General Halevi, will be asking the question of politicians, because it's their duty. And this is a question that our generals, of course, didn't ask our politicians in our recent wars. What does winning look like? Where do you want us to get to? How long do you propose this, or how long will you anticipate this to be? Are we to engage in occupation? If so, after that, then what? And it's these questions, of course, I think that President Biden's been pushing on, and of course, Prime Minister Sunak. And there's no answer yet.
Yeah, and while we're watching the ground offensive preparations taking place and that suggestion that it is imminent that soldiers will be seeing the inside of Gaza very soon, we've also got world leaders, President Biden, Rishi Sunak, as you mentioned, trying to de-escalate, visiting the regional partners. Rishi Sunak in Egypt today. How important a role do those regional partners, Saudi Arabia yesterday, Egypt today, play?
Absolutely central. The prospect of escalation for all of those powers, I think it's fair to say, is nightmarish. But to the extent that they're agents in this, to the extent that they influence this, I think they'll be desperately trying to avoid the conflict spreading over. I think the key to this, or the tipping point, will be when the Israelis cross the border and we see what happens then, the nature of the way that they're going to conduct this operation on the ground tactically. The key thing will be the response, I think, of Hezbollah in the north, who are many times more powerful than Hamas. And I think, in fairness, militarily, Israel's far more worried about that. And that could trigger off something much more deadly, even more deadly than it's been going on now, because that would spread it across the region. And I think what these politicians and diplomats are trying to do is ensure that there's at least a bulwark against that from the friendly powers in the region. And that's why one reason we're seeing such activity now.
And, of course, Israel warning civilians to move away from that border with Lebanon, very worried about what Hezbollah will do. Of course, Iran funding Hezbollah, and this would suit Iran, destabilisation of this region. The last thing they want is for Saudi to sign any deal with Israel and normalise those relations.
I think that deal's been kicked a long way down the road. The leader of Hamas is a guy called Nasrallah. And over the last 20 or 30 years, he's shown himself to be a really wily operator. And one of the things he's going to be concerned about is if he's instructed to or required to politically to intervene heavily in the north of Israel, and then much more powerfully, for 150,000 missiles, probably would overwhelm the Iron Dome system, etc., etc. What would be the effect on Lebanon? And the effect on Lebanon politically would be absolutely disastrous. And I think that's something they want to avoid. Hezbollah wants to remain a force in being, an influence. It doesn't necessarily want to get involved in combat with Israel, because that would be a one-shot deal. They would be destroyed. It'd take a while, but it would be.
Now, Frank, Hamas had planned this attack for more than a year. It will have planned the next phase too. Israel scrambling to catch up here. In terms of its ground offensive, we know it's going to be very challenging because this is urban warfare. They're a very sophisticated military, but what kind of conditions and challenges are they going to encounter?
Well, you may remember it's exactly 7 years ago, we started, the coalition and the Iraqis started the assault on Mosul to clear the Islamic State out. Now, there was a level of preparation there on the part of the enemy that was very significant, but it was overcome. It took 8 months. This will be a much tougher nut to crack because Hezbollah, as you said, has designed this approach, and they'll be ready for the Israelis. Only last night, though, the Israelis that say that they hit 100 targets, very significant. But on the ground itself, booby traps, ambushes, and of course the nightmarish terrain. The Israeli soldiers have to look up. For the first time, they're facing an enemy that has some presence in the air. Drones, attack drones with grenades, and surveillance. They'll be watched. And most importantly, Sarah, underneath the ground, of course, hundreds of miles of tunnels, which will allow Hamas to pop up behind them and maintain that presence. Very difficult to get to.
Frank Ledwidge, thank you very much indeed.